Hello and welcome to Fireside Fairytales. My name is Rory, and you are watching Varietal Literature's YouTube channel. It's a place where we have fun with narrative, and what we're going to do tonight is read some old fairy tales and stories. In particular, we're reading shorter fairy tales from a book I've read some stuff from before. But these are the ones that I specifically didn't read because they're very strange and they're very short. So we're going to read 4 stories. The last one is the most traditional of a story. I still think it's kind of nonsense, but it's fun nonsense. And when I say nonsense, I don't mean it's like invalid as a story. And if you didn't look at the title, I don't know why you wouldn't have, but like these are all Irish tales from Yeats's book. Fairy and folk tales from the Irish peasantry, I think is what it's called, of the Irish peasantry. Yeah, well, I don't know. If you don't want to hear me babble about this, by the way, check the description down below if you're not watching this live. And you'll be able to jump right ahead to whatever story it is you want to listen to. So they'll be down there. I don't think we'll run as long as we normally do. There's 2 reasons for that. One is that the theme makes for shorter stories that don't last as long. And the second is I am growing into an old man, and I have put my lower back out by no obvious reason. Probably just slept on it wrong. And that means sitting for long periods of time is not a thing I can really do this week. So we'll go shorter this week for that reason. Probably in our Thursday show as well. Okay. So we are reading from Yeats's book. Of course, Yeats is an Irish poet, probably most famous for, the mind reels to pick one, but I think the one that I've mostly used is the Isle of Innisfree poem, a very famous poem. And yeah, I think that you would enjoy his poetry. If you haven't read it, you should. But he also was a big fan of folk and fairy tales, as we've talked about on the show before, and he wrote a pretty definitive collection. And one thing that I will remind you, because it's been a while since we've read Yeats, is that Yeats is completely sincere in his belief in that there is an element of truth to all of these tales. And I don't mean like he thinks, oh yeah, there's, the birds that could be seen as, the good people or whatever. He takes it as like a scientist collecting accounts of a world rarely seen. GS says, well, listen while we're sprawled on the floor. By the way, if you are just tuning in, you can go in the chat and add some comments, and I will respond as I'm able to, obviously not during the readings. So what we're going to look at, and the reason why I mentioned that Yeats takes a lot of this stuff pretty seriously, is you might wonder, like, why would he collect a simple story about someone just talking to one or whatever? And it's because he sees himself as sort of tracking a history of people, at these little people in Ireland. They're called the good people. I won't read you the whole thing, but in the beginning of the section, he talks through all these different theories about what the good people are. And they can come in many sizes. They can be tiny little elves. They can be sort of like hobbit-sized. They're usually smaller, but they can definitely be bigger if they wanted to. And there's a theory, apparently, that they might have been angels that fell from heaven, but not in such a serious way that they fell all the way to hell. He puts it as like angels that fell to heaven but landed on their feet. So, I mean, that's something to keep in mind because it comes up in some of these stories. Anyways, that's what we're looking at. We're looking at fairy tales that have kind of an element of being brief and kind of nonsense. And the first one we're going to read is The Priest's Supper from T. Crofton Croker in the book Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry. It is said by those who ought to understand such things that the good people, or the fairies, are some of the angels who were turned out of heaven and who landed on their feet in this world, while the rest of their companions, who had more sin to sink them, went down further to a worse place. Be this as it may, there was a merry troop of fairies, dancing and playing all manner of wild pranks on a bright moonlit evening toward the end of September. The scene of their merriment was not far distant from Inchigala, in the west of County Cork, a poor village, although it had a barrack for soldiers, but great mountains and barren rocks like those round about it are enough to strike poverty into any place. However, in other words, they couldn't have farms. However, as the fairies can have everything they want for wishing, poverty doesn't trouble them much. And all their care is to seek out unfrequented nooks and places where it is not likely anyone will come to spoil their sport. On a nice green sod by the river's side were the little fellows dancing in a ring as gaily as may be, and with their red caps wagging about at every bound in the moonshine, and so light were those bounds that the lobs of dew, although they trembled under their feet, were not disturbed by their capering. Thus did they carry on their gambols, spinning round and twirling and bobbing and diving, and going through all manners of figures, until one of them chirped out, Cease with your drumming, here's an end to our mummin, by my smell I can tell a priest this way is coming. And away every one of the fairies scampered off as hard as they could, concealing themselves under the green leaves of the lusmore, where if their little red caps should happen to peep out, they would only look like crimson bells, a type of flower. And more hid themselves at the shady side of the stones and brambles, and others under the bank of the river, and in holes and crannies of one kind or another. The fairy speaker was not mistaken, for along the road, which was within the view of the river, came Father Horrigan on his pony. Thinking to himself that as it was so late he would make an end of his journey at the first cabin he came to, according to this determination, he stopped at the dwelling of Dermod Leary, lifted the latch, and entered with, "My blessing on all here." I need not say that Father Horrigan was a welcome guest wherever he went, for no man was more pious or better beloved in the country. Now, it was great trouble for Dermod that he had nothing to offer as reference for supper, as a relish to the potatoes, which the old woman, for so Dermod called his wife, though she was not much past 20, had down boiling in a pot over the fire. He thought of the net which he'd set in the river, but as it had been there only a short time, the chances were against him finding a fish in it. No matter, thought Dermod. There can only be harm in stepping down to try, and maybe as I want the fish for the priest's supper, that one will be there before me. Down to the riverside went Dermod, and he found in the net as fine a salmon as ever jumped in the bright waters of the spreading Lee. But as he was going to take it out, the net was pulled from him. He could not tell how or by whom, and away got the salmon, and went swimming along with the current as gaily as if nothing had happened. Dermod looked sorrowfully at the wake, which the fish had left upon the water, shining like a line of silver in the moonlight. And then, with an angry motion in his right hand and a stamp of his foot, gave vent to his feelings by muttering, "May bitter bad luck attend you night and day for a blackguard schemer of a salmon, wherever you go! You ought to be ashamed of yourself if there's any shame in you. Give me the slip after this fashion, and I'm clear in my own mind you'll come to no good, for some evil kind of thing or other helped you. Did not I feel it pull the net against me as strong as the devil is himself?" "That's not true for you," said one of the little fairies, who had scampered off at the approach of the priest, coming up to Dermot Leary with a whole throng of his companions at his heels. "There was only 12 of us pulling against you." Dermot gazed on the tiny speaker with wonder, who continued, make yourself noways uneasy about the priest's suppers. For if you will go back and ask him one question for us, there'll be as fine a supper as ever was put on a table, spread out before him in less than no time. I'll have nothing at all to do with you, replied Dermot in a tone of determination, and after a pause he added, I'm much obliged to you for your offer, sir, but I know better than to sell myself to you, or the like of you, for a supper. And more than that, I know Father Horrigan has more regard for my soul than to wish me to pledge it forever, out of regard of anything you could put before him, so there's an end to the matter. The little speaker, with the pertinacity not to be repulsed by Dermot's manner, continued, Will you ask the priest one civil question for us? Dermot considered for some time, and he was right in doing so, but he thought no one could come to harm out of asking a civil question. I see no objection to do the same, gentlemen, said Dermot, but I'll have nothing in life to do with your supper, mind that. Then, said the little speaking fairy, whilst the rest came crowding after him from all parts, go and ask Father Horrigan to tell us whether our souls will be saved at the last day, like the souls of good Christians, and if you wish us well and bring back word, what he says without delay. Away went Dermot to his cabin, where he found the potatoes thrown out on the table and his good woman handling the biggest of them all. A beautiful laughing red apple, smoking like a hard-ridden horse on a frosty night, over to Father Horrigan. Please, your reverence, said Dermot after some hesitation, may I make a bold to ask your honour one question? What may that be? Said Father Horrigan. Why, then, begging your reverence's pardon for my freedom, is it if the souls of the good people are to be saved at the last day? Who bid you to ask that question, Leary? Said the priest, fixing his eyes upon him very sternly, which Dermot could not stand before at all. I'll tell no lies about the matter, and nothing in life but the truth, said Dermot. It was the good people themselves who sent me to ask the question, and they are down in the thousands down on the bank of the river, waiting for me to go back with the answer. Go back by all means, said the priest, and tell them if they want to know, they can come here to me themselves. I'll answer that or any question they are pleased to ask with the greatest pleasures in life. Dermot accordingly returned to the fairies, who came swarming round about him to hear what the priest had said in reply. And Dermot spoke out among them like a bold man as he was. But when they heard they must go to the priest, away they fled, some here, some there, and some this way, and more that, whisking by poor Dermot so fast and in such numbers he was quite bewildered. When he came to himself, which was not for a long time, back he went to his cabin and ate his dry potatoes along with Father Horrigan, who made quite light of the thing. But Dermot could not help but thinking it a mighty hard case that his reverence, whose words had the power to banish fairies at such a rate, should have no sort of relish to his supper, and that the fine salmon he had had in the net should have been gotten away from him in such a manner. That's our first story. Like I said, nonsense. I mean, not maybe total nonsense, but in terms of like good storytelling, it's definitely on the odder side of things. GS says, you clearly got out of shape. Missing a week of Fireside Fairytales takes endurance. I can see that being something I noticed. I used to teach for several hours a day, and that involved talking for as much as 8 hours a day, sometimes 5 days a week, sometimes 6. And I noticed that when I stopped doing that, my capacity to talk for many hours without a sore throat or anything just diminished. I had an inhuman ability to talk. All right. Well, no reason to waste any time whatsoever. Our next story is called Paddy Corocoran's Wife. So this is Paddy Corocoran's Wife from the book Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry, as collected by W.B. Yeats from William Carleton. Paddy Corocoran's wife was for several years afflicted with a kind of complaint which nobody could properly understand. She was sick, and she was not sick. She was well, and she was not well. She was as ladies wish to be who love their lords, and she was not as such ladies wish to be. In fact, nobody could tell her what the matter with her was. She had a gnawing at the heart which came heavily upon her husband. And for, with the help of God, a keener appetite than the same gnawing amounted to could not be met with of a summer's day. The poor woman was delicate beyond belief. She had no appetite at all, so she hadn't, barring a little relish for a mutton chop or a stock or a bit of meat. Anyways, for sure, God help her, she hadn't last inclination for the dry patty, kind of a bread, or a drop of sour buttermilk along with it, especially as she was so poorly. And indeed, for a woman in her condition, for sick as she was, poor Paddy always was made to believe her in that condition. But God's will be done, she didn't care. A pratty and a grain of salt was a welcome to her. Glory be to his name, as the best roast and boiled that ever was dressed. And why not? There was one comfort. She wouldn't be long with him. Long troubling time. It mattered little what she got, but sure she knew herself that from the gnawing at her heart she could never do good without a little bit of now and then, and sure, if her own husband begrudged it to her, who else she had better right to expect it from? Now you might notice that this is written in a very strange cadence to the modern ear. I'm going to talk about that afterwards. For what it's worth, she's a sickly person who doesn't eat too much, even when it's offered, because she basically can't. Well, as we have said, she lay a bedridden invalid for long enough, trying doctors and quacks of all sorts, sexes, and sizes, and all without a farthing's benefit, until at the long run, poor Paddy was nearly brought to the last pass, almost dead. In striving to keep her in the bit of mate, the 7th year was now on the point of closing, when one harvest day, as she lay bemoaning her hard condition on her bed beyond the kitchen fire, a little weeish woman, dressed in a neat red cloak, comes in and, sitting down by the hearth, says, "Well, Kitty Corcoran, you've had a long lair of it, there on the broad of your back for 7 years. And you're just as far from being cured as ever." "Mavron, aye," said the other. "In truth, that's what I was this minute thinking of, and a sorrowful thought it is." "It's your own fault, then," says the little woman. "And indeed, for that matter, it's your fault that you ever were there at all sick." "Ora, how's that?" asked Kitty. "Sure, I wouldn't be here if I could help it. Do you think it's a comfort or a pleasure to me to be sick and bedridden?" "No," said the other, "I do not. But I'll tell you the truth. For the last 7 years you've been annoying us. I am one of the good people, elves, and I have a regard for you. I'm come to let you know that the reason you've been sick so long as you are, for all the time you've been ill, if you'll take the trouble to remember, your children threw out your dirty water after dusk and before sunrise, at the very time we're passing your door, which we pass twice a day. Now, if you avoid this, if you throw it out in a different place and at a different time, the complaint you have will leave you. So will the gnawing heart, and you'll be as well as ever you were. You don't follow this advice, pardon me, Why remain as you are, and all art the old man can't cure you. Then she bade her goodbye and disappeared. Kitty, who was glad to be cured on such easy terms, immediately complied with the injunction of the fairy, and the consequence was that the next day she found herself in as good health as she'd ever enjoyed during her life. I'll admit that when I got to the end of this one, that's when I was like, I actually had read this one first, because I hadn't read it before, and I got to the end of this one, and I was like, we should just do an episode about just total nonsense. So that if you didn't pick up on it, they basically made her sick for 7 years because she was throwing dirty water on them as they walked by in the morning and evening. Holly's house just posts shamrocks. Okay. Now, as much as that's the one that kind of prompted me to want to do this episode the way that we're doing it, I don't think it's the biggest load of nonsense here. I think this next one definitely takes the cake in that when I say something's nonsense, I want to put this in context. Like, anything is nonsense if you're removed from it, right? So, I'm trying to think of a good example here, and I'm not thinking of one, but basically, like, in the context of its time, I'm sure there's a lot of unsaid things in these stories that make them make more sense. And sometimes they're just sort of a part of the lore that we're not a part of. And that's almost certainly the case. Some things are not explained because they don't feel like they should be explained, right? I think a good example of this was there was a breakthrough some years ago in how the Romans made concrete, I think was basically the gist of it. Or a kind of analog to concrete. And they couldn't figure it out because the recipe they had, they followed to the letter, and it just didn't work. And somebody came to the conclusion that when they said water in that recipe, they meant seawater because that's what's all around them. And of course, seawater has a whole bunch of minerals and salt and so on in them that are not normally found in the kind of water they were probably using. And so when they used that, apparently it worked quite a bit better. You'll have to look into that on your own. But the point is, the writers of those recipes didn't feel the need to clarify seawater because that would have been obvious. Just like we don't feel the need to clarify chicken eggs when we put in a recipe eggs. We know that if they meant something other than chicken eggs, we would have put that in there. And I think a lot of the time the weirdness of folktales and fairy tales follows a similar thing. Like, they don't feel the need to clarify why throwing your wastewater out at the wrong times of day, you might hit the good people. You know, that sounds very weird to us, but maybe that was just sort of a contextual, moral, a real problem in the city that people would throw out their water at the wrong times or whatever. Who knows? Like, things that they don't need to clarify because they weren't talking to us 100 and some odd years in the future. Holly's house says they mean sewage, don't they? She said washing water, so I don't think so, but maybe. Could be both. Okay, but by far, as much as I say all of that, this one is odd. I want to see what you guys make of it. Again, is a very short one. The last one is the longest one. And even then, it's not that long. This is called The Brewery of Eggshells, collected by W.B. Yeats from T. Crofton Croker, who's a person we've read a collected story from before, in the fairy and folk tales of the Irish peasantry. Mrs. Sullivan fancied that her youngest child had been exchanged by fairies' theft, and certainly appearances warranted such a conclusion, for in one night her healthy blue-eyed boy had become shriveled up into almost nothing, and never ceased squalling and crying. This naturally made poor Miss Sullivan very unhappy, and all the neighbours, by way of comforting her, said that her own child was, beyond any kind of doubt, with the good people, Again, elves. And that one of themselves was put in his place. Let me add, they call them the good people, not really because they're good. I think mainly because they don't want to upset them, if nobody's ever picked up on that. Mrs. Sullivan, of course, could not disbelieve what everyone told her, but she did not wish to hurt the thing, for although its face was so withered, and its body wasted away to a mere skeleton, it had still a strong resemblance to her own boy. She therefore could not find it in her heart to roast it alive on the griddle, or to burn its nose off with the red-hot tongs, or to throw it out in the snow on the roadside. Notwithstanding these, and several like proceedings were strongly recommended to her for the recovery of her child. I can see some problems with this belief. One day, who should Mrs. Sullivan meet but a cunning woman, well known about the country by the name Ellen Lee, or Grey Ellen, and she had the gift, however she got it, of telling where the dead were, and what was good for the rest of their souls, and could charm away warts and wens, and do a great many wonderful things of the same nature. "You're in grief this morning, Miss Sullivan," were the first words of Ellen Lee to her. "You may say that, Ellen," said Mrs. Sullivan, "and good, 'cause I have to be in grief. For there was once my own fine child whipped from me out of his cradle, without as much as a by your leave or ask your pardon, and an ugly dawny bit of a shriveled-up fairy put in his place. No wonder, then, that you see me in grief, Ellen." "Small blame to you, Mrs. Sullivan," said Ellen Lee. "But are you sure 'tis a fairy?" "Sure," echoed Mrs. Sullivan. "Sure enough, I am to my own sorrow. And can I doubt my own two eyes? Every mother's soul must feel for me." "Will you take an old woman's advice?" said Ellen Lee, fixing her wild and mysterious gaze upon the unhappy mother, and after a pause she added, "But maybe you'll call me foolish." "Can you get me back my child? My own child, Ellen?" said Mrs. Sullivan with great energy. "If you do as I bid you," returned Ellen Lee, "you'll know." Mrs. Sullivan was silent in expectation, and Ellen continued, "Put down the big pot full of water on the fire and make it boil like mad. Then get a dozen new-laid eggs, break them and keep the shells, but throw the rest away. And when that is done, put the shells in the pot of boiling water, and you will soon know whether it is your bone boy or a fairy. If you find that it is a fairy in the cradle, take the red-hot poker and cram it down its ugly throat. You will not have much trouble with them after that, I promise you." Home went Mrs. Sullivan, and did as Ellen Lee desired. She put the pot on the fire, and plenty of turf under it, and set the water boiling at such a rate, that if ever water was red hot, it surely was. The child was lying for a wonder, quite easy and quiet in the cradle. Every now and then, cocking his eye, he would twinkle as keen as a star in a frosty night over at the great fire, like the one below me, and the big pot upon it. And he looked on with great attention at Mrs. Sullivan breaking the eggs and putting down the eggshells to boil. At last, he asked, with the voice of a very old man, "What are you doing, Mommy?" Mrs. Sullivan's heart, as she said herself, was up in her mouth, ready to choke her at hearing her child speak. But she contrived to put the poker in the fire and to answer without making any wonder at the words, "I'm brewing a Vic, my son." My son is a Vic. "And what are you brewing, Mommy?" said the little imp, whose supernatural gift of speech now proved beyond question that he was a fairy substitute. "I wish the poker was red," thought Mrs. Sullivan, But it was a large one, and it took a long time heating. So she determined to keep him talking until the poker was in a proper state to thrust down his throat, and therefore repeated the question. "Is it what I'm brewing, Vic?" said she. "You want to know?"
"Yes, Mommy. What are you brewing?"
returned the fairy. "Eggshells, Vic," said Mrs. Sullivan. "Oh!" shrieked the imp, starting up in the cradle and clapping his hands together.
"I'm 1,500 years in the world. Never saw a brewery of eggshells before."
The poker was by this time quite red, and Mrs. Sullivan seized it and ran furiously towards the cradle, but somehow or other her foot slipped. She fell flat on the floor. The poker flew out of her hand to the other end of the house. However, she got up without much loss of time and went to the cradle, intending to pitch the wicked thing that was in it into the pot of boiling water, when there she saw her own child in a sweet sleep. One of his soft, round arms rested upon the pillow. His features were as placid as if their repose had never been disturbed, save the rosy mouth, which moved with a gentle and regular breathing. There's some commentary of emojis going on in the chat here. So, like, it's a charming story and all in the sense that it's, like, original and it's kind of fun. But I'm sure other people must have the same thought as me. In a fairly superstitious place where, you know, you don't have internet and you don't have a lot of, like, education and so on. If someone comes around and tells you a story that if your kid looks weird one day, they might be a fairy, so you should shove a poker down their throat. Like, I'm not sure that that's a healthy belief, you know, that you really want to be spreading around a place. Because mental illness is not a new thing. There's people that would maybe have delusions to that effect. That said, all of that sort of morbidity aside, what a strange story. Okay, so that brings us to our last one, which is... GS says postnatal psychosis. Yeah, I thought of that as well. There we are. All right. So this last tale is our longest one. It's not particularly long, but it is our longest. It's called Jamie Freel and the Young Lady. Collected from Miss Letitia McClintock by W.B. Yeats in the Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry. Down in Fanet, in times gone by, lived Jamie Freel and his mother. Jamie was the widow's sole support. His strong arm worked for her untiringly, and as each Sunday night came around, he poured his wages into her lap, thanking her dutifully for the halfpence which she returned to him for tobacco. He was extolled by his neighbors as the best son ever known or heard of. But he had neighbors of whose opinion he was ignorant, neighbors who lived pretty close to him, whom he'd never seen, who are indeed rarely seen by mortals, except on Maeves and Halloweens. An old ruined castle about a quarter-mile from his cabin was said to be the abode of the wee folk. Every Halloween were the ancient windows lighted up, and the passers-by saw little figures flitting to and fro inside the building, while they heard the music of pipes and flutes. It was well known that fairy revels took place, but nobody had the courage to intrude on them. Jamie had often watched the little figures from a distance and listened to the charming music, wondering what the inside of the castle was like. But one Halloween, he got up, took his cap, saying to his mother, "I'm away to the castle to seek my fortune." "What?" cried she. "Would you venture there? That's the poor widow's son? That's the poor widow's one son? Do not be so venturesome and foolish. Jamie, they'll kill you, and then what'll come of me?" "Never fear, mother. Nay harm will happen to me, but I must go." He set out, and as he crossed the potato field, came in sight of the castle, whose windows were ablaze with light and seemed to turn the russet leaves still clinging to the crabtree branches into gold. Halting in the grove, at one side of the ruin, he listened to the elfin revelry, and the laughter and singing made him all more determined to proceed. Numbers of little people, the largest about the size of a child, 5 years old, were dancing to the music of flutes and fiddles, and while others drank and feasted. "Welcome, Jamie Freel! Welcome, 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 Jamie!" cried the company, perceiving their visitor. The word welcome was caught up and repeated by every voice in the castle. Time flew, and Jamie was enjoying himself very much. Which is to say, when his host said, "We're going to ride to Dublin tonight to steal your young lady. Will you come too, Jamie Freel?" "Aye, that I will." "That will I," cried the rash youth, thirsting for adventure. A troop of horses stood at the door, and Jamie mounted, and his steed rose with him into the air. He was presently flying over his mother's cottage, surrounded by the elfin troop, and on they went, over bold mountains, over little hills, over the deep Loch of Swilly, over towns and cottages when people were burning nuts and eating apples and keeping merry Halloween. It seemed to Jamie that they flew all round Ireland before they got to Dublin. "This is Derry," said the fairies, flying over the cathedral spire, and what was said by one voice was repeated by all the rest, till 50 little voices were crying out, "Derry, Derry, Derry, Derry." In like manner was Jamie informed that as they passed over each town on the route, and at length he heard the silvery voices cry, "Dublin, Dublin, Dublin!" It was no mean dwelling that was to be honoured by the fairy visit, but one of the finest houses in Stephen's Green. The troop dismounted near a window, and Jamie saw a beautiful face on a pillow in a splendid bed. He saw the young lady lifted and carried away, while the stick which was dropped in her place on the bed took her exact form. The lady was placed before one rider and carried a short way, then given another, and the names of the towns were cried out as before. They were approaching home, and Jamie heard Rathmullen, Milford, Tomney, and then he knew they were near his own house. "You've all had your turn at carrying the young lady," said he. "Why wouldn't I get her for a wee piece?" "Aye, Jamie," replied they pleasantly. "You may take your turn at carrying her, to be sure." Holding his prize very lightly, he dropped down near his mother's door. "Jamie Freel, Jamie Freel! Is that the way you treat us?" cried they, and they too dropped down near the door. Jamie held fast, though he knew not what he was holding, for the little folk turned the lady into all sorts of strange shapes. At one moment she was a black, barking dog, barking and trying to bite. At another, a glowing bar of iron, which yet had no heat. And then again, a sack of wool. But still, Jamie held her, and the baffled elves were turning away when a tiny woman, the smallest of the party, exclaimed, "Jamie Freel, her and has her away for us, but he shall have no good of her. I'll make her deaf and dumb." And she threw something over the young girl. While they rode off disappointed, Jamie lifted the hatch on his mother's door and went in. "Jamie, man," cried his mother, "you've been away all night. What have they done on you?" "Nothing bad, mother. I have the very best of good luck. Here's a beautiful young lady I've brought you for company." I'm sorry. Just the idea of like your son returning and saying, "Me and the elves stole a girl. Isn't that great?"
Bless us and save us!
exclaimed the mother, and for some minutes she was so astonished that she could not think of anything else to say. Jamie told his story of the night's adventure, ended by saying, "Surely you wouldn't have allowed me to let her gang with them and be lost forever?"
But a lady, Jamie! How can a lady eat? We're poor diet, and we live in we're poor way. I ask you that, you foolish fellow.
Well, mother, sure it's better for her to be here nor over yonder, and he pointed in the direction of the castle. Meanwhile, the dumb and deaf girl shivered in her light clothing, stepping close to the humble turf fire.
Poor creature. She's square and handsome. Nay, I wonder why they set their hearts on her,
said the old woman, gazing at her guest with pity and admiration.
We must ask you first, but what in the name of fortune fit for the likes of her to wear?
She went into her press. She went to her press in the room and took out her Sunday gown of brown drugget. She then opened a drawer and drew forth a pair of white stockings, a long, snowy garment of fine linen, and a cap, her dead dress, as she called it. These articles of attire had long been ready for a certain tryst ceremony, in which she would some day fill the chief part, and only saw the light occasionally when they were hung out to air, but she was willing to give even these to the fair, trembling visitor, who was turning in dumb sorrow and wonder from her to Jamie, and from Jamie back to her. The poor girl suffered herself to be dressed, and then sat down on a creepie in the chimney corner and buried her face in her hands.
What do we do to keep up a lady like that?
I'll work for you both, mother, replied the son.
And how could a lady live on weird poor diet?
She replied. I'll work for her, was old Jamie's answer. He kept his word. The young lady was very sad for a long time, and tears stole down her cheek many an evening while the old woman spun by the fire and Jamie made salmon nets, an accomplishment lately acquired by him in hopes of adding to the comfort of his guest. But she was always gentle and tried to smile when she perceived them looking at her, and by degrees she adapted herself to their ways and mode of life. It was not very long before she began to feed the pig, mashed potatoes, meal for the fowls, and knit blue worsted socks. So a year passed, and Halloween came round again. Mother, said Jamie, taking down his cap, I'm off to the old castle to seek my fortune.
Are you mad, Jamie? Cried his mother in terror. Sure, they'll kill you this time for what you done to them last year.
Jamie laid light of her fears and went his way. She may have a point, though, Jamie. And as he reached the crabtree grove, he saw bright lights in the castle windows as before and heard loud talking. Creeping under the window, he heard the wee folks say, That was a poor trick that Jamie Freel pulled us this night last year, when he stole the nice young lady for us. Aye, said the tiny woman,
and I punished him for it. For there she sits, a dumb image by his earth. For he does not know that 3 drops out of this glass I hold in my hand would give her her hearing and her speech back again.
Jamie's heart beat fast as he entered the hall. Again, he was greeted by a chorus of welcomes from the company.
Here comes Jamie Freel. Welcome, welcome, Jamie.
As soon as the tumult subsided, the little woman said,
You be to drink our health, Jamie, out of this glass in my hand.
Jamie snatched the glass from her and darted to the door. He never knew how he reached his cabin, but he arrived there breathless and sank on a stove by the fire.
You're killed surely this time, my poor boy.
No, indeed. Better luck than ever this time. And he gave the lady 3 drops of the liquids that still remained at the bottom of the glass. notwithstanding his mad race over the potato field. The lady began to speak, and her first words were words of thanks to Jamie. The 3 inmates of the cabin had so much to say to one another that long after cock crow, when the fairy music had quite ceased, were they talking round the fire.
"Jamie," said the lady, "be pleased to get me paper and pen and ink, that I may write to my father and tell him what has become of me."
She wrote, but weeks passed and she received no answer. And again she wrote, and still no answer. At length she said,
"You must come with me to Dublin, Jamie, to find my father."
"I ha no father money to hire a car for you," he replied, "and how can you travel to Dublin on your foot?" But she implored him so much that he consented to set out with her and walk all the way from Fannet to Dublin. It was not as easy as the ferry journey, but at last they rang the bell at the door of the house in Stephen's Green.
"Tell my father that his daughter's here,"
said she to the servant who opened the door. "The gentleman who lives here has no daughter, my girl. He had one, but she died better not nor a year ago."
"Do you not know me, Sullivan?"
"No, poor girl, I do not."
"Let me see the gentleman. I only ask to see him."
"Well, that's not much to ask. We'll see what can be done." In a few moments the lady's father came to the door.
"Dear father," said she, "don't you know me?"
"How dare you call me your father?" cried the old gentleman angrily. "You are an impostor. I have no daughter."
"Look in my face, father. Surely you'll remember me."
"My daughter is dead and buried. She died a long, long time ago." The old gentleman's voice changed from anger to sorrow. "You can go," he concluded.
"Stop, dear father, till you look at this ring on my finger. Look at your name and mine engraved on it."
"It certainly is my daughter's ring, but I do not know how you came by it. I fear in no honest way."
"Call my mother. She'll be sure to know me," said the poor girl, who by this time was crying bitterly.
"My poor wife is beginning to forget her sorrow. She seldom speaks of her daughter now. Why should I renew her grief by reminding her of her loss?" But the young lady persevered, till at last the mother was sent for.
"Mother," she began, when the old lady came to the door, "don't you know your own daughter?"
"I have no daughter.
My daughter died and was buried a long, long time ago." "Only look in my face and surely you'll know me."
The old lady shook her head.
"Have you all forgotten me? But look at this mole on my neck. Surely, mother, you know me now." "Yes, yes," said the mother. "My Gracie had a mole on her neck like that. But then I saw her in her coffin and saw the lid shut down upon her."
It became Jamie's turn to speak, and he gave the history of the fairy journey, of the theft of the young lady, of the figure he'd seen laying in its place, of her life with his mother in Fannet, which for some reason did not involve him bringing her back, or of last Halloween, and of the 3 drops that had released her from her enchantment. She took up the story when he paused and told how kind the mother and son had been to her. Parents could not make enough of Jamie. They treated him with every distinction. When he expressed his wish to return to Fannet, said they did not know what to do to show their gratitude, but an awkward complication arose. The daughter would not let him go without her.
"If Jamie goes, I'll go too," she said. "He saved me from the fairies, and has worked for me ever since. If it had not been for him, dear father and mother, you would never have seen me again. If he goes, I'll go too."
This being her resolution, the old gentleman said that Jamie should become his son-in-law, and the mother was brought from Fannet in a coach and 4, and there was a splendid wedding, and they all lived together in the grand Dublin house. Jamie was heir to untold wealth at his father-in-law's death. GS has said the only comment that really matters here, which is, I don't know why they stole a girl. I assure you, I don't either. I don't know why the fairies stole a girl. I'm sure there's some sort of thing about fairies stealing away children and stuff that almost always exists in some kind of version of paganism. Little forest spirits. But what I don't understand is why he just didn't take her home. I guess the conclusion we're supposed to pull is that he didn't have money for a carriage, but you're talking about, like, a whole person. Just as reward for kidnapping, yeah. Well, there's your nonsense for the day, right? Hopefully you guys enjoyed all that nonsense. I know I certainly did. As I said, have a outback. And so therefore I will not be hanging out very long here. I did want to add one thing though. There was another story I wanted to read, but I couldn't. And you might say, okay, what do you mean you can't read a story? And I just to be clear, fairy tales are done. This is just an interesting little piece of like writing technique in history, something that is a little bit dated. So this was the story I wanted to read, which was the white trout, which is a story about white trouts, which is apparently a thing that's talked about in various parts of Ireland. But like some parts of the stories we did read, and if you're reading it now, you're welcome to, you'll notice that it's written in such a way that the way that the accent alters a word is in the spelling. So instead of saying I did not in the spelling, it'll say dene, right? Which is sort of an approximation of how it sounds. Now that was kind of a standard practice for like this weird patch of about 150 to 200 years. And it wasn't too common because for the most part people just wrote in very proper English about high society. But when it came up, they did write the accents out. Now, sometime around like the 40s, 50s, and 60s, this phased out heavily. And you start to see it in stories that were set in the South, the American South. Originally, a lot of those tales were written in this like heavy slang way. And then eventually what happens is you get these versions of that slang dropped into otherwise normally spelled and written dialogue. And it's interesting because basically you can see sort of over the course of history how writers adjusted. Originally it made sense to be like, okay, let's just write it how it sounds so people know that there's an accent at play here. But what it tends to do is create idiosyncratic spellings of words. And by idiosyncratic, I mean to that specific author. There wasn't really agreed upon ways to write a lot of this accents out. That became almost like a chore to read and were really slowed down the reading experience. And since that's meant to be preserved, and since words, for the most part, are just symbology on sounds anyways, these sort of agreed upon spellings became a lot more favored. And instead what you would do is you drop sort of keywords and you would mention that they spoke in an accent. So like, you know, instead of writing the whole sentence like the sentence on the page here, well, sir, in course of time, the white trout, God bless it, was seen in the shrine by it. When sure the people didn't know what to think of that creature. Seeing as how a white trout was never heard of afore nor since. Like, you wouldn't write it like that now. You might add in sort of the phrasing, the structure, the melody of it. And say that he had like a thick Irish accent. And you might add in, you know, maybe the course or something that was fairly closely. You hint so that a person can hear it, but can still read it. And I've always found that interesting because the first instinct is that we should write it exactly as it sounds, but actually that becomes a chore to read. So this is at a time when that was still the practice. And as a result, some of these stories I simply cannot read because I can barely understand them. I certainly can't ably speak them. And I don't think anybody else would understand what I was saying. if I'm being honest. Not it. I guess not everybody else. Obviously, Irish people would be doing fine with it. The generally North American audience I have, if the statistics of YouTube are to be trusted. Okay. Yeah, I wanted to mention that because I mentioned earlier, like, there was that one story that was kind of pushing it on how much it was written like an Irish sort of rant. Okay, well, it's time for me to go get some Advil, and it's time for you to curl up by the fire. I'll keep it going warm for you. And make sure you join me on Thursday for Idle Show, where we'll have a little silly fun and write together, or next week, where we'll, well, read more fairy tales. Thank you so much for coming by. Have a good sleep.